Imagine this. You're 6 years old, riding your bike until the streetlights flicker on, and that's your cue to go home. No phone, no GPS tracking your location, no parent texting "where are you?" Every 5 minutes, you just exist in the world, alone, and somehow, you survive. That's not nostalgia talking. That's the actual psychological training ground of an entire generation. The people who grew up in the 1970s didn't just experience a different childhood. They developed a completely different operating system for their brains. And if you've ever wondered why your Boomer or Gen X parents act the way they do, why they're weirdly independent but also emotionally unavailable, why they can fix anything with duct tape but figure out how to process feelings, this is your answer. Welcome to the psychology of 70s kids, the last generation raised by benign neglect. Let's call this phenomenon free-range psychology. It's the result of growing up in an era where parenting meant making sure you did you and die, not optimizing your potential. The mechanism here is wild. These kids developed what psychologists call an internal locus of control on steroids. You know how you panic when your phone dies and you can't Google Map your way out of a parking lot? 70s kids navigated entire cities using landmark memory and asking strangers for directions. Their brains literally wired differently because they had no safety net. They had to figure it out. The evolutionary advantage: massive self-reliance. The cost: they never learned that asking for help is a normal human thing. They see vulnerability as a system error, not a feature. The takeaway: if someone raised in the 70s seems like they'd rather chew glass than admit they need support, it's because their childhood taught them that survival means doing it yourself. They're not cold. They're optimized for a world that doesn't exist anymore. Imagine this: you're watching TV, and there are 3 channels. That's it. No Netflix algorithm learning your psychology, no infinite scroll, no dopamine slot machine in your pocket. When the show ends, you go outside and exist in real time with real humans. This created what we'll call boredom resilience. The mechanism is simple but profound. The 70s brain developed an ability to generate its own entertainment, to sit with discomfort, to create meaning from nothing. Modern neuroscience shows that boredom activates the default mode network, the part of your brain responsible for creativity, self-reflection, and problem-solving. 70s kids spent hours in this state. They built forts. They invented games with rocks and sticks. They daydreamed entire universes into existence. Compare that to today, where the average person can't sit through a red light without checking their phone. The 70s generation has a psychological buffer against the attention economy that's absolutely destroying everyone. Born after 1995, the takeaway: their ability to be alone with their thoughts is superpower. It's just what happens when your brain isn't getting dopamine jacked every 30 seconds. They're not more disciplined, they're just running different software. Imagine this: your parents are home, but they're not hovering. They're not asking about your feelings. They're smoking cigarettes in the living room, drinking their 3rd cocktail, and telling you to figure it out. This is emotional minimalism, and it's the psychological foundation of 70s emotional architecture. The mechanism works like this: when emotional support isn't readily available, the developing brain creates compensatory structures. These kids learned to self-soothe, to compartmentalize, to push feelings into a mental box labeled, "deal with this, never." From an evolutionary standpoint, this was adaptive. You become less dependent, more resilient to disappointment, harder to break. But here's the glitch: those boxes never really disappear. They just sit there, packed with decades of unprocessed feelings, waiting to leak out during a midlife crisis, or explode during Thanksgiving dinner. Modern therapy culture would call this trauma. 70s kids call it Tuesday. They genuinely don't understand why millennials and Gen Z treat therapy like a basic utility. Because their entire psychological framework is built on the idea that feelings are optional DLC, not the main game. The takeaway: when someone from this generation says "I am fine" in a tone that could cut steel, they actually believe it. They've confused suppression with strength for so long that they can't tell the difference anymore. Imagine this. You're playing outside, and you fall. You scrape your knee, blood everywhere. Your mum looks at it and says, "You're fine, go rinse it off." No emergency room, no antibacterial everything. No calling the school counselor because you experienced minor pain. This created what we'll call risk calibration mastery. The psychological mechanism is about learned threat assessment. The 70s brain developed an intuitive understanding of actual danger versus perceived danger because they were constantly testing boundaries without a safety committee reviewing their choices. They rode bikes without helmets, played on metal playground equipment that could definitely cause concussions, and somehow learned that most risks don't actually kill you. Modern psychology calls this anti-fragility, the concept that systems get stronger through exposure to stresses. These kids were basically psychological vaccines, building immunity through controlled exposure to life's bullshit. But here's where it gets dark. This same mechanism makes them absolutely terrible at acknowledging legitimate mental health crises. They see anxiety disorders and depression through the lens of just tough it out, because that's what worked for scraped knees. They can't compute that some things actually require intervention. The takeaway: their risk tolerance isn't bravery. It's just a recalibrated threat detector that was forged in an era when be home by dark counted as parental supervision. Imagine this: you want something, and your parents say no, that's it. End of discussion. No negotiation, no explaining their reasoning. No democratic family meeting. Just raw, unappealable authority. This is hierarchical acceptance programming, and it shaped an entire generation's relationship with power structures. The mechanism is straightforward. When authority is absolute and non-negotiable, you develop one of two responses: complete compliance or complete rebellion. No middle ground. 70s kids either became the ultimate rule followers, people who respect systems and chains of command, or they became the original punks, who told every authority figure to get wrecked. There's no in-between. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, this makes sense. Clear hierarchies reduce cognitive load. You don't waste energy questioning everything when the answer is simply because I said so. But the cost is critical thinking. These kids never learned to question whether authority was legitimate, only whether they personally accepted it. This is why you see boomers who either worship institutions blindly or burn them down with conspiracy theories. Their brains weren't trained for nuanced evaluation of power. The takeaway: when your 70s raised parent either blindly trusts everything the news says or believes the government is run by lizard people, it's the same psychological root. They never learned that authority exists on a spectrum. Imagine this. Summer vacation is 3 months long, and nobody plans a single activity. No camps, no structured learning, no resume building experiences. You just exist in time with nothing. This created unstructured time mastery, a psychological skill that's basically extinct now. The mechanism involves executive function development through self-directed activity. When kids have zero scheduled obligations, their prefrontal cortex has to generate its own structure. They learn to initiate projects, create goals, and sustain motivation without external rewards. Modern developmental psychology shows this is crucial for intrinsic motivation. The ability to do things because you want to, not because someone's grading you or tracking your progress. 70s kids developed this naturally. They had to. The alternative was staring at a wall for 12 weeks. This is why they often seem bizarrely self-motivated in random projects, while simultaneously confused about why younger generations need passion and purpose to do basic work. Their brains learned that doing things is just what you do to avoid being bored, not because it fulfills some deeper meaning. The takeaway: they're not more driven, they're just wired to generate their own entertainment, which accidentally looks like productivity. It's not work ethic, it's boredom avoidance that aged well. Imagine this: everyone in your neighborhood is roughly the same race, class, and background. Your entire worldview is shaped by a 50-block radius. You've never met someone from another country. You've never questioned whether your normal is actually normal. This is monoculture conditioning, and it's the invisible foundation of 70s social psychology. The mechanism is about schema formation, the mental frameworks we use to understand reality. When your developmental environment has zero diversity, your brain doesn't build flexibility into its cultural operating system. These kids grew up assuming their experience was universal, because they literally had no counterexamples. There was no internet showing them how people live in other countries, no social media exposing them to different perspectives. Their entire psychological map of humanity was drawn from their immediate surroundings. The evolutionary advantage was social cohesion. When everyone shares the same norms, cooperation is easy. The massive disadvantage is rigidity. When the world suddenly goes global and multicultural, these brains struggle to update. They experience cultural change as a personal attack, because their psychological framework has no space for different, can also be valid. The takeaway: when your 70s parent says things used to be simpler, what they mean is, my brain was built in a monoculture, and diversity feels like cognitive overload. They're not necessarily bigoted. They're running outdated social software that can't handle the modern world's complexity. Imagine this: you're 8 years old, and your parents are getting divorced, or your dad lost his job, or your mum is having a breakdown, and nobody explains anything. You just notice things are different, scarier, and you're expected to act normal. This created information scarcity adaptation, a psychological pattern where 70s kids learned to function without context or explanation. The mechanism involves cognitive gap filling. When children don't receive information about major life changes, their brains create narratives to make sense of the chaos. Sometimes these narratives are accurate, often they're not. But the skill they developed was continuing to function despite massive uncertainty. Modern psychology recognizes this as a trauma response, but 70s kids see it as normal operating procedure. They learned that you don't need to understand everything to keep moving forward. You just compartmentalize the confusion and handle your responsibilities. This makes them incredibly functional during crises. They don't freeze when things get weird, because weird was their baseline, but it also makes them terrible at proactive communication. They never learned that sharing information prevents problems, because their formative years taught them that information is withheld by default. The takeaway: when your 70s parent doesn't tell you important things until the last second, it's not malice. It's their childhood teaching them that people just figure things out on their own. They're not withholding. They're defaulting to their origin software. Imagine this: you come home from school, and the house is empty for 3 hours. You're 7 years old. You make yourself a snack, watch TV, maybe set something on fire accidentally. Your parents find out days later, if ever. This is unsupervised autonomy training, and it's why 70s kids have such weird confidence mixed with such weird anxiety. The mechanism is about learned competence through trial and error without supervision. These kids figured out how to exist independently at an age when modern children are still getting driven to playdates. They learned to assess danger, make decisions, and handle consequences alone. From a developmental psychology standpoint, this builds massive self-efficacy, the belief that you can handle whatever comes. But it also builds what we might call brittle independence. They're great in a crisis they can solve alone, but terrible at collaborative problem-solving because they never practiced it as kids. They see team efforts as inefficient because their formative experiences taught them that doing it yourself is faster and more reliable. The takeaway: their independence isn't confidence. It's a childhood defense mechanism that calcified into a personality trait. They're not lone wolves by choice. They're just running childhood survival strategies in adult bodies. Here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. The psychology of people who grew up in the 1970s isn't better or worse than what came after. It's just optimized for a world that doesn't exist anymore. They're like perfectly adapted organisms whose environment suddenly changed. All those skills, the self-reliance, the boredom tolerance, the risk calibration, they were features in the 70s. Now they read as bugs. And the weird part is, they don't even know it. They think everyone else changed, when really, the game changed around them. They're NPCs running outdated code in a massive software update they never consented to. And maybe that's the most human thing about them. They're just doing what all of us do, trying to survive using the tools their childhood gave them. Wondering why nothing works the way it used to, unable to see that the world doesn't match their internal map anymore. That's not a 70s problem. That's just being human in a reality that moves faster than brains can adapt. You're not broken. The world just changed the rules while you were playing.